In and for Europe is a hot topic right now. On March 5, French President Emmanuel Macron declared that, quote, Europe's future does not have to be decided in Washington or Moscow, and he called for discussions on the possible extension of the French nuclear umbrella to its European allies.
Our nuclear deterrent protects us. It is complete, sovereign, fully French. I decided to open the strategic debate on the protection through our nuclear deterrent of our allies in the European continent.
And a number of European states have begun conversations about what they might do independently of the United States to enhance their own security. Several frontline states in the East have embraced the idea of a French umbrella, with expressions of interest from both the President of Lithuania and the Prime Minister of Latvia. Germany's Chancellor-in-Waiting said that these several states must become stronger together in nuclear deterrence in Europe. And Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk argued that Poland must seriously consider the French proposal. That came in the context of some other comments by Tusk in terms of expanding their army and their defense spending, and even talking about near universal military training. So what might a French nuclear umbrella or Polish nuclear capability look like? What are the implications for broader NATO defense efforts? I'm Tom Karako, Director of the Missile Defense Project here at Csis. I'm joined with Heather Williams of the Project on Nuclear Issues and Kari Bingen of the Aerospace Security Project. We're going to be taking questions from the audience, so they'll come here to the tablet, so please feel free to submit them. So let's start with you, Heather. What did President Macron say, and what do we think about it?
I think the most important takeaway from Macron's statements is that this is a discussion, not a decision. To very quickly repeat a part of his quote that I thought was really important, I've decided to open the strategic debate on the protection by our deterrence of our allies on the European continent. And so it should be obvious, he isn't saying, I am making this decision. He is saying, let's have the conversation. And he recognizes that it will be a debate. But the other big thing to take away is that this is a signal. The allies are trying to tell us something. I think they're trying to tell us many things. Before I get to that, though, just to give a little bit of context on French nuclear doctrine, because I do think it is important for the conversation, is that France's nuclear arsenal is specifically for self-defense, they say, but a really key term in French nuclear doctrine is this term vital interests. And it's only for vital interests that France would consider using its nuclear weapons. This is pretty ambiguous. We don't know exactly what it means, but after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Macron indicated that France's vital interests might now be expanding to include other parts of Europe, or a European dimension, as he called them. But also, as you mentioned, this isn't just a French conversation. The Germans, the Poles, really all of NATO is getting pulled into this. So as I said, the Europeans are trying to tell us something. I think there's three big things that they are trying to signal with this conversation. The first is that they don't think the threat from Russia is going to go away. Whenever the war in Ukraine ends, whatever the peace settlement may be, that is not going to be an end to the Russian threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Trump, it seems, is making some progress in the relationship with Russia. This seems to be a priority for him. But one of our takeaways from the past few years should be Vladimir Putin is not someone to be trusted. Whatever that peace settlement is doesn't mean we go back to status quo ante. Putin has consistently relied on nuclear threats as part of this invasion of Ukraine. And when the war ends, it is possible that Putin's takeaway from this experience will be, wow, territorial expansion backed by nuclear threats might be pretty effective. And so that might expand. The second thing the allies are trying to tell us is that they do want to be doing more. They have noticeably stepped up on defense spending since the invasion of Ukraine began. They're stepping 90 warheads air and sea-based delivery mechanisms, but to really have a credible deterrent, it's never going to replace what the U.S. provides right now, but that might require some forward deployment. So you're getting more and more European countries involved, more and more domestic. All to say, coming back to where we started, this is the start of a conversation that I think is going to continue for a while. But Kari, I'd be really interested to hear, what did you take away as significant from some of Macron's statements, but also the other statements coming from European leaders?
Well, and Heather, I want to build on some of the things you said, because yes, I see signaling or posturing here from the French, from other European allies, but I think it's more than that. And you hit the nose on the head, is there is this reckoning occurring in Europe right now. And it's not just the Trump administration revisiting its Europe and its NATO policy and demanding that the Europeans take on more responsibility for their security, but it is also that Europe is facing this stark reality, as you said, that the Russian threat is not subsiding, but it's actually increasing. And I mean, let's call a spade a spade. You know, the Europeans are already under attack. Now, it may not be conventionally, but we're seeing an incredible amount of unconventional or gray zone warfare being waged on the continent. Sabotage, assassination, cyber, information operations. I agree with you. I think Putin is emboldened by what's happening now. He's growing his military. He announced, we're going to increase our active force to 1.5 million. There is incredible battlefield learning happening within his forces. He's learning that he can outlast the West. Now, he does have domestic and industrial-based issues, but he's learning, hey, protraction, if I can engage in a protracted conflict, the West will lose its will. And you're also then seeing the side effect of this, which is closer relationships between Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Pyongyang on arms, supply chains, manpowers, which I don't think, initially I would have said I thought this was a coalition of convenience, and there is a convenience there, but I don't think that those relationships are subsiding. And nuclear forces, whether it be for us, our allies, our adversaries, I mean, it is an ultimate security guarantee to deter our adversaries, to hedge against uncertainty. I mean, for us, and you've highlighted this before, nuclear forces are the foundation of our security. I mean, we make decisions about our conventional force size and composition, knowing that the nuclear force underpins them. So it's not a surprise, I guess, that, and frankly, I think it's prudent that the Europeans are also thinking about ways to increase both their conventional and their nuclear deterrent. But I agree with you. I mean, I think we've got to be careful what we wish for here, and there's a whole host of challenges, not only on the European side, but there's a lot of things that I think the U.S. should also examine in this. Is this really in our interest to revisit our extended deterrence commitments, and do we really want to see these independent or more autonomous nuclear capabilities on the European continent? But Tom, what do you think about?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to emphasize the context. I'm also skeptical that France is going to be able to do this. You mentioned the number of warheads, but it's also their doctrine, how they think about it, and frankly. I also caught his line, Macron's line, that they were going to do this without raising taxes. So no more money, but somehow a new. So I think that I will tell you, I've had more people kind of refer to the NPT and like, hey, is this really working out for us in the past couple weeks than I have in quite a while? And to Kari, to your point, I think this also is similar to the conversations that we're seeing in Japan, for instance. I mean, I think it's fantastic that Japan is getting 400 Tomahawks, but 400 Tomahawks is not going to stop China. And so I worry that the diagnosis that we and our allies have kind of come to of we've got to step up our conventional deterrent to have a blunting strategy, a strategy of denial. I think that's all great, but the question is whether we have moved out on that sufficiently fast to have the results. And if the window has closed to get a big conventional buildup for conventional deterrence, then I think that's where you're going to see more folks reach for the nuclear deterrent side of things, to potentially include Japan, as we've heard from former and the late Prime Minister Abe in the week after the 2022 invasion. He asked that question about a nuclear sharing arrangement with the United States. And then the current Japanese Prime Minister has kind of said things about that as well in his private capacity.
And the Koreans as well.
Korean public opinion polling. If I can just pick up on your point about Japan, because I do think it's really important, which is to say America's allies in the Indo-Pacific are going to be watching really closely what happens in the European theater and vice versa. And this is really one of the implications of being in this so-called two-peer competition, which is it isn't just two sets of adversaries that you have, it's also two sets of allies. And they do all watch each other. And so while on the one hand, there might be some logic to the notion of, okay, shift our focus. We're going to prioritize Indo-Pacific, let the Europeans take care of themselves, step up on the conventional, potentially the nuclear front. that also sends a signal to the Indo-Pacific allies, which is not necessarily the one you want to send, which is our commitments might be a little more fluid than they have been in the past. And so for the Indo-Pacific allies, that could also incentivize some proliferation challenges. And with that in mind, I did just want to comment on the NPT point. You know, one of the risks of the withdrawal of the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent or umbrella, if that happens, to be clear, none of this has happened. The U.S. is still in NATO. The U.S. still extends its nuclear deterrence across Europe. But if that happens, there is a risk of proliferation. Extended nuclear deterrence is one of the best, if not the best, non-proliferation tool in history. A more proliferated world is not in America's interest any longer. And so that connection between our nuclear umbrella and the proliferation aspect, I think, is a really important one. And this is all happening at a time when a lot of the guardrails are falling off, right? The NPT it's not particularly strong at the moment. It's had 2 failed review conferences. It is the foundation of the nuclear order. It's one of the reasons why we haven't seen more proliferation, but it isn't really strong right now. And so on top of that, states might be feeling additional proliferation pressures because of concerns about their security. And so in some ways, for me, this just really stresses the importance of the enduring U.S. extended deterrence mission, I think.
Well, and on extended deterrence, there is this perception that the U.S. may be reducing its extended deterrence commitments. I have not seen administration officials say as much, particularly in the nuclear arena, but I think it's also useful for us just to put back out there is why, in this day and age, why is extended deterrence, in particular extended nuclear deterrence, important? And you know, if you had an audience with the president, what would you say? What key points would you make about why extended deterrence is important and relevant today?
What I would say, and then I want to hear what Tom says, what I would say is that this isn't a one-way deal. This isn't just we give something and they don't give anything back. We get a lot back. It is not like-for-like exchanges, but European contributions on conventional capabilities, on air and missile defense. They have been increasing their defense spending. Also, I don't think we should overlook their intelligence contributions, the intelligence sharing, the information that we get from being part of NATO is really significant. And I think that is one of our best chances of deterring this more emboldened Russia that we might see coming. But also, if you are really interested in China, which we know the president is, then my message would be, if you really want to stand up to China, then make a show of force, or not literally show of force, but signal just how committed you are to allies, and you can do that in Europe. And showing that it is a two-way street and that we do get something out of it. But what do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I just to kind of state the obvious in terms of the broader context here, I think we wouldn't be having this conversation if there hadn't been that unfortunate Oval Office exchange between Zelensky and President Trump and Vance. So I think just that obvious thing needs to be stated. And I think there is, as bad as that was, I think that there is nevertheless a silver lining here, that it is good to see the Europeans appearing to be taking this more seriously than they have in the past. And if you'll indulge me, I want to read a statement from the Secretary of Defense, who said, I think the kind of emotional and historical attachment that Americans have had to this NATO alliance for nearly 65 years is aging out. Decisions and choices are going to be made more on what's in the best interest of the United States going forward. My hope is that the fact that reality is changing in the United States will get the attention of European leaders to realize that the drift of the past 20 years can't continue, not if they want to have a strong transatlantic partnership with the United States. And that was not Secretary Hegseth. That was Bob Gates in his exit interview in 2011. So my point being, this has been a long time coming. We need Europeans to step up, and I've been fond of pointing to, Prime Minister Tusk's statement, where he kind of tells his European colleagues, hey, there's 400 million Europeans asking 300 million Americans to defend them against 150 million Russians, or 140 or something like that. So I think he gets it, and I think what you're seeing in Poland, for instance, talking about military training, they're buying stuff hand over fist. I think that's all for the good. I would also commend the new NATO IAMD, Integrated Air and Missile Defense Policy thing that was put out last month in February. I think that's a good thing. It's very clear in terms of what needs to be done on that front. So I think, again, more Europeans doing more, including for the nuclear mission. I mean, my mind immediately goes to dual capable aircraft, and maybe there's Polish pilots that can be training on that mission, or maybe the Brits have some role there. So I think there's little things that we've been talking about for a while that could be done. It's not like Poland needs to be enriching something for the next 10 years in order to get to this capability or contribute to it in some way. I think there's a lot of little steps that could be done here.
Well, and if I can pick up off of that, oftentimes we talk about extended deterrence as it's us, the United States, we are extending our nuclear umbrella, or we're doing something for you, and we need to reassure you that we're going to be there for you when needed. I mean, I think we also have to remind ourselves there are specific United States security interests with this extended deterrence as well. So I think there's a proliferation argument, but also, I mean, the basic premise here is I think it is in our interest, our United States interest, to maintain control over these incredibly destructive weapons, for us, United States, to be able to manage the risks with how these conventional conflicts could escalate, potentially cross the nuclear threshold, potentially pull us in, and minimize the spread of nuclear weapons, whether it's to allies and partners or to adversaries and terrorists. And for our own nuclear forces, having access beyond our shores, integrating with our allies, I think it expands our own deterrence options and our own options that are provided to the president. It strengthens the credibility and the readiness of the triad, especially the air leg. When you think about tactical air capabilities, these dual capable aircraft that Tom mentioned, you can't do a lot with them if you're only limited to U.S. CONUS-based operations. So you need to be abroad. You need to rely on the infrastructure, logistics, maybe even tanker support from these allied countries that are much closer to the threat than we are. And you mentioned show of force. I actually think we need to do more of those shows of force. Consider even further forward basing options. Look to our allies to contribute even more to our collective nuclear deterrence mission in basing, infrastructure, logistics, DC, you name it. I think there's more that they can do to show how serious they are about this collective nuclear mission.
I think you just made a really compelling case for extended deterrence. I'm wondering, would you make that case differently if you were making it on Capitol Hill as opposed to making it to the president? Do you think that on Capitol Hill, is there a different conversation happening about the value of allies and the importance of extended deterrence? Or do you think that all of those points would have the same impact?
I think you have to do both, but I sometimes worry that we do get lost in the, how does our nuclear capability also benefit from working with the allies? That yes, proliferation is incredibly important, but it's not just that. It also actually benefits our capability, the credibility, the readiness of our forces, and our ability to project power and deter bad guys. Mm-hmm.
I think, again, connecting this to the broader conventional deterrence question and the build-up on that front, I mean, yes, European defense stocks skyrocketed after the Ukraine Oval Office visit, but I would say there's some reasons for mixed optimism on that front. I mean, we've seen some European countries stepping up on the munitions, that sort of stuff in the past couple of years, but to be clear, there's a long way ahead that could go in terms of we're still, as Bob Gates pointed out in 2011, there's a lot of members of NATO that are still not up to 2% or whatever it is in terms of their spending. So I think there's a long way to go. I think you're exactly right to emphasize that the Macron thing was probably a signal more than it was a change in their nuclear doctrine. I mean, that would be a massive change, and so I think again I'm skeptical on that front.
Just to pick up on your point about conventional, because I think this is really important, what it seems like is the direction of travel is that Europeans are recognizing, to some extent, the U.S. will be shifting. Don't call it a pivot, but that U.S. resourcing attention in Europe might not be what it once was. And I think the Europeans have been planning for this. It's not like this came as a surprise to them that this might be happening. In a lot of ways, they have been trying to prepare and make certain investments. And it seems like the division of labor will be, okay, we will really step up on conventional. We will invest more in air defenses, in logistics support for the nuclear mission, but also in tanks and munitions, all the rest of it. But that nuclear piece, there really is no replacement for the U.S. But even on the conventional side, Tom, I think this is a really important point. What we are talking about, if the Europeans really want to take the lead on conventional deterrence in Europe against an emboldened Russia, I mean, this is unprecedented coordination among a group of countries that don't have the best history if you look back more than 50 years. And, I think one of the surprises for me, at least, from Putin's invasion, it probably was a surprise for Putin as well, was NATO unity. There was an assumption in Moscow, I suspect, no idea what Vladimir Putin thinks, but there may have been an assumption that Europe won't hold. When we really test the limits of how much European NATO members and how much the U.S. care about Ukraine, NATO will do nothing. And that's not what happened. And I actually think that it's been a really surprising trend to come out of this war. The endurance of that unity, I worry about a little bit. It is going to continue to be tested. Also, we shouldn't forget there are some very anti-nuclear views within a lot of European countries that might have some domestic influence as this debate heats up. And so in some ways I was surprised that Macron was like, let's have the debate, let's have the discussion, because Europeans have been avoiding this exact debate for decades. And now he says, let's open it up. So all to say that division of labor, I think, is becoming a little bit clearer. It will work if the U.S. can maintain the nuclear extended deterrent component and if the Europeans can somehow come together in a way that we really haven't seen before.
And frankly, that's something that would probably be viewed positively by the White House right now, is
Right.
if the response to this is, okay, we're actually going to spend more on defense, which is kind of what Trump has been saying for a while now. So again, I come back to Germany and France, especially. I mean, you think, yes, Poland is out there massively doing the right thing. But Poland and France and the UK, I think, have to be at the center of this conversation. And yes, there has been positive movements on that since 2022, but I think about the mini act play that has been Germans aren't going to send tanks to Ukraine unless the United States does. There's still no Taurus cruise missiles going to Ukraine for all these different reasons. So I think there's been a ton of restraint. And if I'm not mistaken, yes, the 100 billion euro that was talked about by Germany. I think they're counting roads maintenance and that, what counts for defense, for instance. So I think there's, again, a long ways to go. I would point to to praise Germany here, the European Sky Shield Initiative, that I think they've gotten a surprising number of countries on board with what appears to be a procurement-centric initiative. And Germany is now licensed production or co-production of the PAC-2 missile, for instance. So good efforts on that front. But you know what you're also seeing? You're also seeing the perennial parochialism. Say France is not going to get on board with Germany's initiative. And so you're still seeing those kind of rivalries. So it's not quite one Europe just yet in terms of everything.
Well, and even the nuclear alliance. I mean, France has not been part of the NATO nuclear planning group. So there is a lot that would have to happen on the nuclear front to even move in the direction that's being proposed by these leaders, right?
Yeah, and the UK simply can't handle it. It cannot unilaterally provide NATO's nuclear umbrella. It's only 4 submarines, and they ask a lot of those submarines, and those submarines are going through replacement right now. But also, in terms of the UK in particular, if the UK did want to expand its nuclear mission, make some of those bigger investments, this might also apply to other European countries. It hasn't yet hit the publics in a way that would really test things. So for example, in the UK, the National Health Services, it's the national religion. And I say that as having lived there and having benefited from the NHS services, so I'm very grateful for that. However, if things like these defense investments started really impacting things like the NHS, then that's where this is going to become a real challenge, and not just on nuclear, on conventional as well, I think.
Yeah, it's going to come down to money. Show me your defense budget, and I'll tell you what your deterrence plan is.
Unless they're willing to take out more debt, but
again, and Macron says we're not going to spend any more money, and so that's why I'm skeptical again that there'll be a big posture shift by France. It reminded me a lot of when he stepped out maybe a year or two ago and said strategic autonomy, and was kind of campaigning to be in the limelight for the strategic autonomy stuff. So we'll see, but I think when I see increased defense spending in the 2020s by these countries, then I'll believe it.
And that's a great point. I mean, as we all know from having worked directly or tangentially with our own nuclear weapons enterprise, it is a huge, huge undertaking. I mean, let's not kid ourselves in terms of the scale, the technical knowledge, infrastructure, testing facilities, the expense, and just the amount of time and cost, expense and time it will take. I mean, this is enormous. And I think, again, from an American perspective, we're going through this modernization issue right now. I mean, I want attention focused on U.S. nuclear modernization, NC3 modernization. And I think, the same, frankly, pressure that the United States is putting on the Europeans, do more for your own defense, including on the conventional front. There's probably an adjacent or complementary conversation to have on the nuclear front as well. Is, yes, we'll continue to commit to extended deterrence, but can you guys step up as well and further support our modernization efforts, our basing infrastructure efforts, dual capable aircraft, whatever those things are. I think there's more room for them to further step up.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, Heather, I'm curious. I think I mentioned the pilot training, for instance, and you mentioned the nuclear planning group. Is there what other steps come to mind for you in terms of what other nations within NATO or current ones could be doing on that front?
Yeah, I think there's a couple options. So one of them, I don't want to downplay the DCA option. I actually think that that's probably the easiest, the quickest, which is for the countries that are already buying the F-35A or considering the F-35A, is to do nuclear certification on those as well. And then that, again, it isn't just the practical contribution to deterrence. This also does send a signal, because those are still, those are U.S. nuclear weapons that are involved in that mission. And so this is still a U.S.-led initiative, which I think is a really important one to emphasize. The other one would be not just the DCA mission, but if you also had basing of nuclear warheads in additional countries. That can become challenging, not just for the domestic political dynamics in those countries, but also it's expensive. Nuclear safety and security requires a whole lot of precautions and a whole lot of money and certain types of facilities. And so that would also be a pretty big investment. The other idea that I hear being floated around a bit is a new standoff capability. Which would be
as opposed to the gravity bombs.
Correct, correct. And I've heard Europeans asking for this for a while now. It would definitely send a signal. The challenge might be it might add to those modernization efforts. And going through with the current modernization plan, I think needs to be the priority. I'm still waiting for that executive order committing the Trump administration to following through on nuclear modernization along with the Slick Amendment. Hasn't happened yet, but maybe next time that the three of us get together, I'll have my EO. But until then, and so I think the DCA mission, standoff capabilities. The other option, coming back to France, is that what the extreme option would be for France to join the nuclear planning group. But there are other options within there. So France could be an observer of the nuclear planning group without fully joining. Some of the benefits of that are they will get more insights into joint nuclear planning, exercising, operations, the logistical support that goes with it. Because if they're outside of the NPG, they have to recreate all of that themselves in this hypothetical umbrella that Macron is talking about. And so that's one option that I would be really curious to hear the French explore in this debate.
Something else that we haven't talked about is, up till now, we've been focused on a concern of proliferating nuclear capabilities to our allies. But there's also a counterproliferation aspect here of, let's ensure our adversaries don't continue to race for nuclear weapons. And the country that comes to mind and what this administration has been very focused on in the past is Iran. So is there also space here to link greater, I'll say, counter-WMD, counter-proliferation efforts getting the Europeans to put further pressure on Iran, maybe North Korea, as part of a more comprehensive engagement on nuclear security issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of Europeans would love to get back to some sort of a deal with Iran. The challenge will be a political one, which is separate. If the Trump administration wants to take that path, it will be how do they do so, separating it from the previous agreement, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which the Europeans, they've really played an important role in this, and they were incredibly proud of the effort that went into it, the UK, France, and Germany in particular. And I know from talking to some folks there is a sense that we worked so hard for this, and the previous version of the Trump administration did away with it, but they still believe in that deal. They still want to revive it, and they still want to find a way to save it. And so that, if, depending on the direction the administration wants to go in, that's one, I think, really important opportunity for engaging with the Europeans on an Iran deal. Another one I would point to, though, is on more kind of informal risk reduction measures that I think getting a deal with Russia is going to be really, really hard. The president said, I want an arms control deal with Russia and China.
I want a pony.
And yeah, me too. And so getting the Chinese to the table for that is just going to be a huge challenge. In the absence of arms control as we know it, which has played a role in reducing nuclear risks over time, in a more dangerous European security environment, the Europeans want some sort of risk reduction. I don't think they want traditional arms control because that could be undermining the nuclear deterrent. And so that's another important opportunity, I think, for the administration to work with the allies on a more diplomatic level.
Let me ask a question that's come in from the audience, which is, NATO has been talking and having dialogue with various allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. How does the recent kind of kerfuffle about Ukraine, and how does the statements by European leaders, how do you think that's going to influence that prospects of cooperation with Indo-Pacific countries?
Too soon to tell. But things like the NCG, the Nuclear Consultative Group with South Korea, but also AUKUS, those mean a lot to the allies. They aren't just symbolic demonstrations of the U.S. commitment and, you set up a dialogue, so what? No, there's much more substance behind that, which the allies have consistently said they really value and appreciate. The point I would make to this administration about those dialogues and the value of them is this is one of the best, is that our allies in the Indo-Pacific are one of the best tools for deterring and, if need be, defeating China. If that is your goal, standing up to the Chinese, whether that is militarily, economically, politically, for regional deterrence purposes, for control or for influence in the international order, those allies are one of your best tools for doing that. And these are things that really reassure them and that get them on side with you. But I will say I did hear from some colleagues in South Korea in particular after the Ukraine incident. I'm sure we all got a lot of signal messages that day. But that made them nervous. That really made them nervous. And so again, I really want to stress that point. Allies in one theater watch what happens in the other. And so some sort of dramatic change in U.S. security commitments to Europe, that does not help us in the Indo-Pacific. If anything, I think it might cause a bit more concern there and could undermine those alliances, which, coming back to that point, this is one of the best tools for deterring and, if need be, defeating China. No. But, I mean, have you been hearing things from allies in the region as well?
No, I think the concerns that have been expressed to me have been similar, I think, to what is being shared with you on Signal. I do worry what Xi Jinping is taking away from Russia's advances. And Russia, they're learning a lot on the battlefield. They're learning that if I stick it out and work with my own allies, work with the Chinese, with the Iranians, et cetera, that Western will erode. And I don't want Xi Jinping to take away that message vis-a-vis Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific. Pure and simple.
I think your point, Heather, about the two theaters are linked, right? They watch each other, but they're also linked substantively. And I think substantively in terms of there's going to need to be economic solidarity with our NATO and European friends if we are, no kidding, in a tariff war with China or some other kind of a potential war with China. So I think that's very well said. So, well, any closing thoughts on what all this means?
Let's see. Yeah.
Macron said he wants a debate. I look forward to hearing the debate. A few things that I'm going to be watching for as this evolves. It's not just intra-European discussions, it's domestic debates within those European countries. That, NATO unity, as I said, surprised me. There were a lot of feet flapping underneath the calm waters when that happened. And so watching the domestic debates in Europe, I think is going to be a really important one. The other thing that I really want to watch is how is Russia perceiving all of this? What is going to be the Russian response? It does feel like we're in a bit of a holding pattern right now to wait and see what comes of, and that Putin-Trump 90-minute phone call. That, if that's progress, we haven't yet seen we don't yet know what that means. We don't yet know what that looks like. If that does mean, some peace settlement that is equitable, at which, Ukrainians have a say, and if it brings more peace and security to Europe, that's great. But we just haven't really seen the meat on the table for what that looks like. But I think that when that happens, I really am curious how this is all being perceived in Moscow. Do they take Macron's statements as credible? Do they think that Paris would stick up for Kyiv in any future conflict? And then the last one, I'm really glad that Kari brought up modernization, is the way forward with the U.S. nuclear modernization plans. In his confirmation testimony, Csis said, I'm 100% committed to this in answer to a question from Senator Fisher. And I would really like to see the administration commit to that in some more substantive forms as well.
Well, and to that point, to deter our adversaries, period, the president needs more options, whether they be nuclear options, conventional, unconventional, something in between. I mean, you want to give him as many flexible, tailorable options as possible, and that includes the nuclear arena. So I absolutely agree with you, whether it's for our own deterrence purposes or for our extended deterrence commitments to our allies. I would also then just add is, we tend to, when we talk about extended deterrence, we tend to focus on ways to strengthen, I'll say, U.S. extended deterrence and to reassure our allies, and that's important. Don't get me wrong, but I also think that there's an opportunity here to shift the conversation, maybe to educate a bit more on reminding folks of how extended deterrence benefits our own security, our own deterrence posture beyond just proliferation. And, as NATO looks hard at, increasing budgets above 2% GDP and additional conventional force investments that they can make, let's make sure that they're also looking at what additional commitments and contributions they can make on the nuclear front as well.
Yeah, I'll just close up by saying, Heather, to your comment about the Ukraine deal and disarmament talks and all this kind of stuff, I hope the administration remembers a talking point from its previous go-round, which is that no deal is better than a bad deal, and a deal at any cost is not a good thing. So thanks everybody for tuning in. This has been a great conversation. I don't think we've solved all the world's problems, but I'm sure this will be back. And tune in again for joint conversations with the CSIS.